What was supposed to be a quiet roadside stop quickly turned into a nightmare. A young boy found himself in unimaginable danger, and with no one else willing to step in, only one man had the strength to stand up for justice. Shaquille O'Neal never expected to face a challenge like this. But when the moment came, he didn't hesitate. Watch until the end to see how it all unfolds. What would you do in this situation? Let us know in the comments. Like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss powerful stories like this. Shaquille O'Neal's black SUV rolled steadily down the quiet highway, the golden hues of the setting sun casting long shadows across the open road. The evening air was still, and the only sounds were the low hum of the engine and the occasional rustling of dry grass along the roadside. After a long day, Shaq just wanted to get home, but his gas gauge was running low. Up ahead, he spotted a small old-fashioned gas station sitting alone in the middle of nowhere. It looked like something out of a past era. A single gas pump, a worn-out convenience store, and a neon sign flickering weakly above the entrance. A few old pickup trucks were scattered around the lot, their owners nowhere in sight. It was the kind of place that felt frozen in time. Shaq pulled in and stepped out of his SUV, stretching his massive arms before heading toward the pump. He unscrewed the gas cap and started refueling, his mind drifting as he listened to the rhythmic clicking of the pump. Then, a loud gasp broke the silence. "No way! Is that Shaquille O'Neal?" A teenage boy nearly dropped his soda, his eyes wide with disbelief. Within seconds, he sprinted toward Shaq, waving frantically. The call had been heard. More people turned their heads, and within moments, a small crowd formed. Teenagers, adults, and even a few gas station employees came forward, their faces filled with excitement. Phones were pulled out, cameras flashed, and voices buzzed with energy. Shaq turned to face them with a relaxed smile. "That's me, big fella." The teenager grinned ear to ear. "Man, I can't believe this. You're a legend. Can I get a picture?" "Of course," Shaq replied, already taking selfies with several people. He was used to attention, but in small towns like this, the excitement had an extra level of purity. He shook hands, signed shirts, and exchanged a few jokes with the locals. The energy was infectious. Among the crowd, a young black boy stood slightly apart, clutching something in his small hands. He wasn't jumping or shouting like the others. His eyes were locked on Shaq with a mixture of awe and nervous determination. Shaq noticed him and crouched slightly to meet his eye level. "That for me, champ?" he asked, pointing at the sign the boy was holding. The sign was homemade, slightly wrinkled, but decorated with bright letters that read, "You're my champion." The boy nodded, gripping the paper tightly. "I watch all your games," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "You're the best." Shaq smiled warmly. "What's your name, buddy?" "Jordan." "Well, Jordan, this is awesome." Shaq reached out to shake his hand, then pulled the boy into a friendly side hug. "Never give up, all right?" Jordan beamed, nodding furiously. The crowd cheered, capturing the heartwarming moment on their phones. But, in the distance, near the edge of the lot, a different kind of audience watched with an entirely different energy. 6 motorcycles were parked near the entrance, their chrome gleaming under the station lights. Sitting on them were men who weren't interested in autographs or handshakes. They were the Viper Reapers, a gang that prided itself on intimidation and control. Their leader, Clayton, was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and a snake tattoo curling around his neck. He leaned against his Harley, arms crossed, watching Shaq with an amused smirk. "Look at this clown," Clayton scoffed, nudging one of his men. "Playing hero for a bunch of nobodies." One of the bikers, a wiry man with a scar down his cheek, chuckled. "All size, no fight. Bet he wouldn't last a second in a real scrap." Clayton's smirk twisted into something darker. "My brother, he was a real fighter. No cameras, no scripted nonsense. He put his life on the line and nobody cared. But this guy," he gestured toward Shaq, "they treat him like a king just for dunking a ball." Another biker sneered. "Maybe we should remind him what real strength looks like." Clayton's grin widened. "Yeah, let's go introduce ourselves." The group moved as one, their boots crunching against the gravel as they sauntered toward Shaq. The moment shifted. The crowd, once buzzing with excitement, began to quiet down. Some instinctively stepped back as the bikers approached. The air became tense, thick with unspoken warning. Shaq, still crouched next to Jordan, noticed the sudden silence and slowly rose to his full height. He turned just as Clayton and his men closed the distance. "Well, well," Clayton said, his voice dripping with mockery. "If it isn't the big man himself, out here playing hero for the kids." Shaq met his gaze, his expression calm but firm. "Just minding my business. You should try it." The bikers chuckled, their laughter carrying an edge of menace. Clayton stepped closer, towering over Shaq. "You think you're tough, huh? All that muscle, all that fame, but I bet you wouldn't last a second in a real fight." Shaq remained relaxed, but his stance was solid. "Not looking for trouble, man. How about we let it go?" Clayton's smirk widened. "What's the matter, big guy? Afraid? Or maybe you're just another Hollywood fake?" Before Shaq could respond, a small voice cut through the air. "Shaq isn't fake. He's the best. Leave him alone." The words were spoken with conviction, but the voice trembled slightly. Jordan had stepped forward. The moment he did, the entire crowd gasped. Clayton turned his head slowly toward the boy, his grin vanishing. A dangerous glint flickered in his eyes. He crouched down, leveling himself with Jordan. "You got a lot of guts, kid," he said, his tone eerily calm. "But let me tell you something about heroes." Then, without warning, Clayton grabbed Jordan by the front of his shirt and yanked him off the ground. The boy's feet dangled as he gasped in shock. The crowd froze. Someone let out a choked cry. Jordan's mother, standing just feet away, screamed his name but was too terrified to move. Shaq's entire body tensed, his fists clenched at his sides. Clayton leaned in closer to Jordan, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're as weak as your hero. Let's see how fast your little dreams burn." Then, in one horrifying motion, Clayton grabbed the gas pump and doused Jordan's shirt in gasoline. The crowd erupted in terrified screams. Jordan's mother collapsed to her knees, sobbing. The strong smell of fuel filled the air. Shaq did not move. His face was blank. His breathing was slow, controlled. Then Clayton flicked open a lighter. A small flame sparked to life. The world went silent. Shaq's voice was low, deadly. "You just crossed the line." Then he moved. The flame flickered in Clayton's grip, casting an eerie glow across the gas station lot. The acrid scent of gasoline hung thick in the air, mixing with the hushed, panicked breaths of the onlookers. Jordan's small frame trembled as the fuel soaked through his shirt. His wide eyes locked onto the flame dancing inches from his chest. His mother sobbed, her hands clasped together as if in silent prayer. Shaquille O'Neal stood motionless, his entire body coiled like a spring. His jaw was clenched, his fists tight at his sides, Every muscle in his massive frame was taut with controlled fury, his deep breaths slow and deliberate. The world around him blurred, everything narrowing down to one simple truth. Clayton had gone too far. The biker leader smirked, reveling in the terror he had created. "See, big man," Clayton murmured, tilting his head. "This is real power, not cameras, not games. One flick." He shifted his fingers around the lighter. "And it's over." Before he could move, Shaq exploded into action. The speed was unnatural for a man his size. In the blink of an eye, Shaq's massive hand snatched Clayton's wrist, squeezing with a force that sent a sharp crack echoing through the night. The lighter slipped from his fingers before it could ignite the fumes, bouncing harmlessly onto the pavement. Clayton barely had time to react before Shaq's other hand slammed into his chest, sending him stumbling backward with a pained grunt. Jordan dropped to the ground, gasping as he scrambled away from the danger. His mother rushing to him, wrapping him in a desperate embrace. Clayton roared in rage, clutching his crushed wrist. "You son of a—" Shaq didn't wait for him to finish. His massive hand clamped around Clayton's collar, yanking him up before delivering a thunderous punch to his gut. The impact sent Clayton crashing to his knees, his breath leaving him in a strangled wheeze. The bikers snapped out of their shock. The moment Clayton hit the ground, they lunged. The first man swung a metal chain in a wide arc, aiming for Shaq's head. Shaq ducked just in time, the chain slicing through empty air. Before the biker could recover, Shaq's massive arm shot forward, gripping the chain in mid-swing. With one powerful yank, he ripped the weapon from the man's grasp and whipped it around, the metal links cracking against the biker's ribs. The man yelped, stumbling backward and collapsing onto the pavement. Another biker, a wiry man with a broken beer bottle, rushed in from the side. He lunged for Shaq's face, the jagged glass glinting under the station lights. Shaq sidestepped, his hand grabbing the attacker's wrist and twisting it sharply. The bottle fell with a clatter, and before the man could react, Shaq drove an elbow into his ribs. A pained grunt escaped the biker's lips as he crumpled to the ground, wheezing. The next two attackers came together. One wielded a lead pipe, the other cracked his knuckles, looking for an opening. The pipe came down, but Shaq caught it with one hand. The biker's eyes widened in disbelief as Shaq's grip tightened around the metal. Then, in one swift motion, Shaq snapped the pipe across his knee as if it were nothing more than a twig. The biker staggered backward, his confidence shattered along with his weapon. The second man hesitated. It was a mistake. Shaq grabbed him by the collar and belt, hoisting him up like a rag doll before launching him over the hood of a nearby car. The man's body slammed onto the windshield, the glass spiderwebbing under his weight. He groaned but didn't move. The last remaining biker was already backing away, hands raised. "Hey man, I don't want—" Too late. Shaq stepped forward, gripping the front of his leather jacket. With a bone-rattling headbutt, he sent the biker crumpling to the ground, out cold. Silence. The gas station was littered with groaning, half-conscious bikers. A few twitched, trying to crawl away from the wreckage of their arrogance. The only one left standing was Clayton. Still gripping his stomach, Clayton staggered forward, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. His entire crew had been wiped out in under a minute. His pride burned hotter than any gasoline fire ever could. His fingers trembled as they reached inside his jacket. A glint of metal. A knife. He flicked the blade open, his breathing ragged, his pupils dilated with fury. He pointed the knife toward Shaq, his hand still shaking from the damage it had taken. "This ain't over," Clayton growled. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his eyes locking onto the blade. His stance didn't shift. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward. Clayton's grip faltered. Another step. Clayton's breath quickened. A final step. Shaq was inches away. The tension was suffocating. Then, without warning, Clayton lunged. Everything slowed. Shaq sidestepped at the last possible second, letting the blade slice through nothing but air. Before Clayton could recover, Shaq's hand clamped around his wrist. With a sharp twist, he forced the knife free, sending it clattering to the ground. Clayton's eyes widened in pure panic. Shaq's other hand shot forward, gripping the front of his leather jacket. Then, with one brutal motion, Shaq lifted Clayton into the air. For a single, fleeting moment, Clayton's feet dangled. Then Shaq slammed him onto the pavement with an earth-shattering force. The attitude adjustment shook the entire lot. The impact was deafening. Clayton's body hit the ground so hard that the air left his lungs in a strangled wheeze. He didn't move. The crowd erupted into cheers, but Shaq didn't acknowledge them. His eyes scanned the scene. Jordan was safe, held tightly in his mother's arms, tears streaking her face. The bystanders were slowly emerging from their frozen state, whispering in shock. The fight was over. Or at least, it should have been. A faint scraping sound broke the silence. Shaq turned his head. Clayton wasn't done. He groaned, coughing, his fingers crawling toward something on the ground. Something metallic. Something dangerous. The lighter. His hand closed around it. Shaq saw. His boot came down, crushing Clayton's hand against the pavement. Clayton screamed. Shaq leaned in slightly, his voice quiet, almost gentle. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." The distant wail of sirens filled the night. The piercing wail of sirens cut through the heavy silence, flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the shattered glass and battered bodies sprawled across the gas station lot. The once lively crowd was now frozen in place, their excitement replaced by awe and disbelief. Some clutched their phones, not for selfies this time, but to capture the wreckage of the fight they had just witnessed. Shaquille O'Neal stood tall in the middle of it all, his breath slow and steady, his body still coiled with tension. His boot pressed into Clayton's crushed hand, the lighter now useless beneath the sheer weight of his presence. Clayton whimpered, his face contorted in agony, but even through the pain his eyes burned with unyielding rage. He had walked into this fight expecting to humiliate Shaq, to prove that his own twisted version of strength was superior. Instead, he was now the one left broken, his entire crew wiped out in less than a minute. The first police cruiser skidded to a stop, gravel crunching under its tires. Its doors flew open, and uniformed officers spilled out, weapons drawn. "Hands where we can see them," one of them barked, his flashlight scanning the scene. Another officer, older and stockier, with a neatly trimmed mustache, took a step forward, his sharp eyes assessing the wreckage. His gaze landed on Shaq, his expression shifting from stern professionalism to pure disbelief. "Shaquille O'Neal," he muttered under his breath. Shaq gave a small nod. "That's me." The officer's eyes darted to Clayton, still pinned under Shaq's boot, then to the scattered bikers, groaning or unconscious. The lot looked like the aftermath of a bar brawl gone nuclear. "What the hell happened here?" the officer asked, rubbing his temple. Before Shaq could answer, a small shaky voice broke the tension. "They tried to hurt me." All heads turned. Jordan, still clutching his mother's side, his small frame trembling, looked up at the officers. His mother, her eyes red and puffy from crying, held him as if she was afraid he might slip away. The mustached officer's gaze hardened. "Hurt you? What do you mean, son?" Jordan swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. They poured gas on me. They were gonna light me on fire." A heavy silence followed his words. The officers, who had arrived expecting some kind of bar fight, suddenly realized this was something far darker. The mustached officer's face turned red with barely contained fury as he turned back to Clayton. "Is that true?" Clayton, still gasping from the pain in his ribs and his crushed fingers, let out a bitter chuckle, his voice hoarse. "Kid's got a big imagination." Shaq's patience finally snapped. He reached down, grabbing Clayton by the front of his jacket, yanking him upright with one arm, forcing him to his feet like he weighed nothing. Clayton let out a strangled groan as Shaq's grip tightened. "You were seconds away from turning a kid into a human torch," Shaq growled, his voice low and menacing. "Don't you dare try to talk your way out of this." "Let him go," the mustached officer ordered, stepping closer. "We'll take it from here." Shaq held Clayton's glare for a long, tension-filled moment before finally releasing him with a rough shove. Clayton stumbled, barely managing to stay on his feet before two officers grabbed him, twisting his arms behind his back and slapping cuffs onto his wrists. One of the younger officers, recognizing Clayton immediately, let out a humorless chuckle. "Well, well, if it isn't Clayton Kane, how many times we gotta haul your sorry ass in?" Clayton barely reacted, his mind still spinning from the humiliating beating he had just taken. Instead, he smirked as they pulled him toward the squad car. "Don't get too comfortable, boys," he sneered. "You know how this goes. A few hours, I'm out, and we're right back where we started." Shaq's jaw tightened, but he didn't react. He had seen men like Clayton before, bullies who thought they were untouchable, who relied on fear, connections, and the right people in the wrong places to keep them above the law. The mustached officer turned to Shaq, shaking his head. "Don't listen to him. We've been trying to pin something solid on him for years. This time we've got witnesses, plenty of them." Clayton, already half inside the squad car, let out a dry chuckle. "You really think that changes anything?" He turned his head toward Shaq, his smirk cruel. "You got lucky tonight, big guy. That's all this was. Luck." Shaq took a step closer, his voice calm but firm. "If luck is what stopped you from setting a kid on fire," he said, "then yeah, I'm the luckiest man alive." Clayton's smirk faltered for the briefest second before the door slammed shut, sealing him inside. The remaining bikers, those who were still conscious, were rounded up, cuffed and dragged toward the other cruisers. Some cursed under their breath, others stayed silent, their eyes darting around in search of an escape that didn't exist. As the officers secured the scene, Shaq turned back to the real reason he had fought tonight. Jordan. The boy was still pressed against his mother, his small hands clutching the fabric of her jacket. His big, wide eyes looked up at Shaq, filled with admiration, gratitude, and lingering fear. Shaq crouched down so they were at eye level. "You okay, champ?" Jordan nodded slowly. You saved me." Shaq smiled softly. "You were real brave tonight. Braver than a lot of people would have been." Jordan hesitated, then reached out his small hand. Shaq looked at it for a second, then shook his head. Instead of a handshake, he pulled Jordan into a tight hug. Jordan froze for a moment, then wrapped his arms around Shaq's massive frame, holding on tight. "Thank you," the boy whispered. Shaq pulled back, ruffling Jordan's hair. "You don't have to thank me, buddy. Just remember, Being strong doesn't mean picking fights. It means standing up for what's right. You did that tonight." Jordan nodded, his admiration for Shaq growing even stronger. His mother, still shaking, wiped a tear from her cheek. "I don't even know how to thank you," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. "You saved my son." Shaq placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to thank me. Just keep that little guy safe." The flashing police lights illuminated the gas station, now eerily quiet after all the chaos. Officers finished taking statements, loading the last of the arrested bikers into their vehicles. The crowd, which had been too stunned to move earlier, began dispersing. Some still whispered among themselves, staring in awe at Shaq. He ignored them as he walked back toward his SUV. Just as he reached the driver's side door, Jordan ran up behind him. "Wait!" Shaq turned. Jordan held out a small piece of crumpled paper. "I made this for you," he said, cheeks flushed with pride. Shaq took it, unfolding the paper carefully. It was a drawing, a simple sketch of Shaq standing tall, victorious, with the words, "My hero," scrawled across the top. Shaq smiled, his fingers brushing over the drawing. He carefully folded it and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "This is awesome, champ," he said. "I'll keep it somewhere special." Jordan beamed. With one last wave, Shaq climbed into his SUV, started the engine, and pulled onto the highway. The gas station faded behind him, the flashing lights disappearing in the rearview mirror. The road stretched ahead, quiet and empty. Tonight he hadn't just won a fight. He had reminded everyone, including himself, what real strength truly meant. The road stretched endlessly before Shaquille O'Neal, the hum of his SUV's engine, the only sound breaking the stillness of the night. The adrenaline from the fight had faded, leaving behind a quiet weight in his chest. His grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly as his mind replayed everything that had just happened. The fear in Jordan's eyes, the stench of gasoline hanging thick in the air, the flickering flame just inches away from turning a child into a tragedy. Shaq had seen many things in his life, had fought battles inside and outside the court, but this was different. This wasn't a game. This wasn't a scripted moment for entertainment. This was real. He reached into his jacket pocket, fingers brushing over the crumpled paper Jordan had given him. Pulling it out, he unfolded it and glanced down at the drawing. The simple sketch showed him standing tall, victorious, the words, "My hero," scribbled above in a child's careful handwriting. Shaq exhaled slowly. He didn't think of himself as a hero. He had just done what anyone should do. But the truth was, not everyone would. A bright set of headlights in his rearview mirror pulled him from his thoughts. At first, it was just a vehicle in the distance, barely noticeable against the darkness. But as he continued down the highway, it became clear. The car wasn't just heading in the same direction. It was following him. Shaq narrowed his eyes, his instincts sharpening. The vehicle, a black SUV, was keeping pace, its lights unwavering. A bad feeling settled in his gut. He had seen enough setups, enough ambushes in his time to know when something wasn't right. This wasn't a coincidence. His grip on the wheel tightened as the SUV inched closer. The highway was empty. Nothing but miles of open road ahead. If something was about to go down, there would be no witnesses. Then, without warning, the SUV sped up. Shaq barely had time to react before the heavy vehicle swerved into his lane, slamming into the side of his SUV. The impact sent his vehicle skidding, tires screeching against the pavement as he fought to maintain control. His heart pounded, instincts kicking in as he jerked the wheel, forcing the SUV back onto the road, but the other driver wasn't done. The black SUV veered toward him again, this time with more force, trying to run him off the highway completely. Shaq clenched his jaw. He didn't know who was behind the wheel, but he had a damn good guess. Clayton. Even from the back of a squad car, he had found a way to strike back. Shaq's eyes flicked to his surroundings. The road was isolated, no exits in sight, no places to turn off. He was alone. The black SUV made its next move. It swerved violently, attempting to ram into him again. Shaq reacted instantly, slamming on the brakes. The other driver wasn't expecting it. As Shaq's vehicle dropped back, the black SUV swerved wildly, overcorrecting and nearly spinning out. Shaq saw his opening. He jerked the wheel, ramming the front of his SUV into the rear bumper of the other vehicle. The impact was immediate. The black SUV spun out of control, tires screeching as it veered off the road and crashed into a ditch. Shaq pulled over, his pulse still racing. He pushed open the door and stepped out, boots crunching against the gravel. The other vehicle's engine sputtered, smoke rising from the hood. The windshield was cracked, but there was movement inside. Shaq moved cautiously. If this was Clayton's doing, whoever was inside wasn't alone in this. The driver's side door swung open violently, and a man stumbled out, clutching his forehead where it had slammed against the steering wheel. He was built thick, muscular, but he wasn't Clayton. He was one of the bikers from earlier, one of the few who had managed to escape the gas station before the cops arrived. The biker glared at Shaq, blood dripping from a cut above his eye. "You should have stayed out of it," he spat, his voice dripping with hatred. "You don't know who you're messing with." Shaq's expression remained cold, unreadable. "I know exactly who I'm dealing with." The biker wiped the blood from his face, his hands shaking with adrenaline and rage. "Clayton's got people everywhere," he sneered. "You think tonight was bad? This is just the beginning." Shaq took a slow step forward. The biker flinched. Even after everything, he was still afraid. Shaq exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You've already lost." The biker's body tensed as if he wanted to charge, but the weight of the night, the fight, the crash, the realization that Shaq wasn't someone he could intimidate, made him hesitate. Then Shaq heard it. Sirens. He picked them up before the biker did, the distant sound of approaching police. The biker's eyes darted to the road, panic flashing across his face. Without another word, he turned and took off running, disappearing into the darkness. Shaq didn't chase him. He didn't need to. The man was already broken, already beaten. As the police sirens grew louder, Shaq turned back to his SUV. Exhaling slowly, he climbed back into the driver's seat. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As he reached into his pocket again, his fingers brushed against Jordan's drawing. He pulled it out one more time, staring at the words written across the top. "My hero." His grip on the paper tightened slightly. Shaq didn't know if he believed in heroes, but he knew one thing. As long as there were people like Clayton in the world, people who thought they could hurt the innocent and walk away, he wouldn't stop fighting. Because some battles weren't about winning. They were about standing up. Shaq put the SUV into drive and pulled back onto the road. The highway stretched endlessly before him. Somewhere in the distance, the sirens wailed, and Shaquille O'Neal kept driving. The road ahead was dark and endless, stretching into the unknown as Shaquille O'Neal drove in silence. The adrenaline had faded, but the weight of the night still lingered in his chest. His fingers gripped the steering wheel, his thoughts circling back to the gas station, to Jordan, to the lighter flickering in Clayton's hand. He had seen a lot in his life, but nothing had burned into his mind like that moment. A second later, and the boy could have been lost forever. The flashing blue and red lights in the distance signaled that the authorities had finally reached the crash site. Shaq checked his rearview mirror, watching as the wreckage of the black SUV disappeared behind him. The biker who had tried to run him off the road was gone, but it didn't matter. He had left the scene, but he wouldn't escape the consequences. Cops would find the wreck, trace the plates, and before long he'd be in a cell next to Clayton. Shaq sighed and reached into his pocket, pulling out Jordan's crumpled drawing. His eyes traced the bold letters at the top. My hero. A small, proud smile tugged at his lips. He didn't consider himself a hero. He was just doing what needed to be done. But for Jordan, for the people at that gas station, for everyone who had witnessed what happened that night, he had been more than just a basketball legend. He had been the one who stood up. The road remained empty, the hum of the tires against the pavement steady and rhythmic. Then, from the corner of his eye, Shaq noticed something in the distance. Up ahead, a pair of headlights flickered in the dark. A car was pulled over on the side of the highway, hazard lights blinking weakly. He slowed the SUV as he got closer, scanning the scene. A woman stood beside the car, her arms wrapped around a small child. Shaq pulled onto the shoulder and rolled down his window. "You all right, ma'am?" The woman turned, her face weary but relieved. "Our car broke down," she said, shifting the little girl in her arms. "My phone died and we've been standing here for almost an hour. No one stopped." Shaq nodded, stepping out of his vehicle. He towered over them, his presence massive yet calm. "Where you headed?" "Just a few miles down. My sister's house." "Hop in," Shaq said without hesitation. "I'll get you there safe." The woman hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Shaq opened the back door, helping the little girl inside. She blinked up at him with wide eyes. "You're really tall," she whispered. Shaq chuckled. "So I've been told." As they drove, the woman glanced at him, realization dawning on her face. "Wait, you're Shaquille O'Neal, aren't you?" Shaq gave her a small smile. "That's me." Her eyes widened. "I saw something on the news earlier, something about a fight at a gas station. Was that?" Shaq didn't answer right away. He simply nodded. "Yeah, that was me." She exhaled, shaking her head. "That was brave of you." Shaq's grip on the wheel tightened slightly, his voice low. "It wasn't about being brave. It was about doing what's right." Silence settled between them for a few moments before the little girl piped up from the back seat. "Did you save someone?" Shaq glanced at her in the mirror. "Yeah, I did." "Like a hero?" Shaq thought of Jordan, of the way the boy had stood up for him without fear. He thought of the way Clayton had tried to burn that courage away, to teach the world that strength belonged only to those who took it from others. He thought of the people who had been too afraid to act, who had stood frozen in place as a child was threatened. And he thought of himself, of the choice he had made, the line he had drawn, the stand he had taken. He smiled softly. Something like that. The woman's sister's house wasn't far, and when they arrived, she thanked Shaq more times than he could count. As she carried her daughter inside, she turned back one last time. "The world needs more people like you." Shaq nodded once before stepping back into his SUV. As he pulled away, the sky was beginning to lighten at the horizon, the first hints of dawn breaking through the darkness. The road stretched ahead of him, long and empty, but Shaq knew better than to think the fight was over. There would always be people like Clayton. There would always be people like Jordan. And as long as Shaquille O'Neal had the strength to stand, he would always choose to fight for what was right. The SUV rumbled forward into the early morning light, and for the first time that night, Shaq allowed himself to breathe. Justice was served, but the fight for what's right never truly ends. Some battles aren't just about strength, they're about standing up when no one else will. Shaquille O'Neal proved that true heroes don't wear capes. They take action. What do you think about this story? Would you have done the same? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to spread the message. More powerful stories are coming soon.